From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. Well, President Trump announced his outline to get the U.S. economy going again. That was last evening. Today, equity markets are up, apparently, on that news. So we know how the markets are reacting to the outline. Let's find out how Washington is. And for that, we go to Josh Wingrove. He's our Washington correspondent who covers the White House for us there. So, Josh, in watching that yesterday, it was an impressive rollout, 3 phases, a little indeterminate about time and things like that. At the same time, was this a substantive move forward toward getting the economy back going, or was this more of a communications device? Because the president kept saying it's up to the governors, it's up to the governors.
Yeah, I mean, it's both. He began the week by sort of claiming absolute power to order the governors to do stuff if he wanted to, and then yesterday gave them essentially the ball and said it's up to you. And then today is tweeting apparent support for anti-shutdown measures, protests in a series of Democrat-led states, including Michigan, a very crucial state in 2020. So he's going back and forth between whether he is in power or he is not in power when it comes to these decisions. The main critique of the measures he introduced yesterday, which will allow states that believe that they have it under control to start loosening restrictions, is that we really still don't have testing capacity to catch quickly any outbreaks that might pop up, and that is fueling concerns that there might be a second wave either in pockets and regions or nationally that would, of course, potentially lead us back to having to reimpose shutdown measures. So that is the concern right now, but certainly Trump wants at least some states to start moving towards an opening.
So the president doesn't talk that much about testing, but every single public health official we talk to says that is key. We have to be able to test to know whether we're going too fast, too far, so we can rein it back in and really control it again. Do we have a sense that actually the White House has their arms around the testing? I mean, do they know what testing really is available? Do they have a means, whether under the Defense Production Act or otherwise, to ramp up the test kits?
There are calls from Democrats for them to use that DPA to ramp up testing, and the testing question is complicated. You know, for the one hand, we need to expand testing of people that we think might have it and people that have met folks that do have it. We're nowhere near having the capacity to do that right now. And there are all sorts of bottlenecks. Some places are short on swabs to actually, conduct the test. Some places are having bottlenecks in the actual processing of the tests. The other thing that we're really missing is antibody tests. If you're an employer who wants to safely bring your workers back into the workplace, you might want an antibody test to know who's had it, who has some resistance to it, is there immunity to it? These are questions we don't have. This is testing capacity we don't have. And so some employers, if they choose to open, are going to be rolling the dice because they won't really know which of their employees have had it and which have not.
Another place where we don't have the capacity as of today is actually on getting some money into small businesses. They ran through that $349 billion rather quickly. There are plans to get it going up at the Capitol Hill, but that seems to be deadlocked. I understand Vice President Mike Pence is going to have a call with Democratic senators today. Is that about that funding issue, and where does that stand?
Yes, absolutely. And for Republicans, it's a simple issue. They just want a straight top-up of that PPP money for small business. Democrats say, though, the program isn't working. It's skewing more to the bigger of the small businesses, if you will, the true mom and pop, the smallest of the small. They're complaining that they haven't been able to access this, and of course now it's tapped out of money. So the Democrats want changes on it. Chuck Schumer was on television this morning saying he and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and Speaker Pelosi are continuing to talk on this. He says he doesn't know why they wouldn't be able to get a deal in the next few days, but it does look like it will take those next few days. So again, they want changes to it. Democrats say this program isn't working, whereas Republicans say the Democrats are holding it up and they should just do a straight top up and deal with other stuff later in a so-called Phase 4 aid bill.
Okay, thank you so much to Josh Wingrove, our White House correspondent down in Washington. And now it's time for Bloomberg First Word News, and for that we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, more and more U.S. homeowners aren't paying their mortgages. According to a report by Black Knight, nearly 3 million American home loans are in forbearance plans that allow delayed payments without penalty. The homeowners skipping payments because of lost jobs or income represented 5.5% of borrowers with $651 billion in unpaid principal. More than 20 million Americans have filed for unemployment in the last 4 weeks. The British government wants its money back for coronavirus tests that didn't work. Britain spent nearly $20 million on more than 3 million antibody tests at the beginning of April, hoping to find which people had been exposed to the virus. British officials had said they hoped the tests could be made available on Amazon and at pharmacies. The virus death toll in the UK has risen to more than 14,000. In Spain, the government reports more than 5,200 new cases of coronavirus. That's the most in a week. Spain has the world's second most extensive outbreak. Authorities say the country already has passed the peak. They're starting to focus on how to relax nationwide restrictions. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks very much, Mark. Coming up here, Amanda Glassman of the Center for Global Development is here to talk about President Trump's decision to stop funding the World Health Organization. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. As we said earlier, equity markets are up today, maybe because there's some encouraging news about possible treatments for the coronavirus, maybe because President Trump has an outline, at least, for getting us back to work. But whatever the case, Abigail Doolittle is here to explain exactly what the equity markets are doing.
Well, it's certainly an interesting session for the financial markets on this Friday, and it does have a lot to do with those reopening plans or guidelines from President Trump. Now, what makes it so interesting is stocks in the pre-market were much higher, up 3.5%. Now we have the S&P 500 still solidly higher, up more than 1%. But it reminds me a little bit of buy the rumor, sell the news. So the plan or the idea of reopening, perception is everything. I think that traders hearing that word, really snapped up stocks very quickly. But in terms of those guidelines, there are certainly lots of holes, lots of timing ahead, and lots of uncertainty. So you can see that reflected in the fact that the S&P 500 is off of those highs. At the highs, up 3.5% in the pre-market, now up 1.4%. But take a look at the tech-heavy NASDAQ. Now, at this point, down 0.2%. That's been one of the leaders. So that tells you that some investors are perhaps nervous or just facing some uncertainty around this. Plus, the NASDAQ has been up so much more, perhaps profits being taken off there. Another interesting idea, take a look at the New York FANG index, David. Amazon, of course, has been on fire. A lot of those big tech stocks that do well when people are at home. So the idea that maybe we will be reopening relatively soon, perhaps putting a bit of a breather for those stocks. So that's an interesting nuance, again, to think about. But the big story beyond stocks rallying on the day, David, crude oil. Take a look at WTI, down 8.3%. This is really important. If we consider a year-to-date picture of crude oil and the S&P 500, crude oil has been leading the entire way lower out of the coronavirus. There's a big divergence now. It's a barometer of the economy and of risk appetite, David. It could suggest that stocks may take a breather overall from the big rally they've had over the last couple of weeks, David.
Okay, thank you so much to Abigail Doolittle for that report on the markets. President Trump earlier this week criticized the World Health Organization for its handling of the coronavirus crisis, at least in the early stages, and as a result, suspended, as he put it, U.S. funding for the organization. Welcome now, Amanda Glassman. She is Executive Vice President as well as Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. So, Amanda, thank you so much for being here. First of all, give us a sense, does President Trump have a point about the way the WHO handled this in the early stages?
I don't think so. The World Health Organization really relies on officially reported data from its member countries. It has to ask for permission to enter countries and investigate outbreaks. And I think they reported to us what they knew when they knew it. Obviously, we wish that those reports had come out sooner, and we wish that fuller reports are available all the time. The question is whether we want to give the World Health Organization the teeth to be able to go in and investigate when we hear signs of an outbreak. Is the World Health Organization going to become like the International Atomic Energy Agency, for example, that can send in inspectors?
Yeah, so I want to come back at the end to talk about possible reform, but on the specific issue about what happened in the early stages, as I understand it, the WHO's main power is sort of naming and shaming, as it were. And one of the things that's being said by some about the WHO is they didn't call out China early enough because they didn't let their people get in there. They didn't get enough information. Is that unfair?
I think it is unfair. You have to see what's going on the ground to be able to use data to give some view on what's going on. So I do think it's off.
So give us a sense now, what is the significance of the U.S. defunding for some period of time? It's for a particular period of time, supposedly while there's an investigation. What does that do to the WHO operations right now today?
So it's significant. The U.S. assessed contribution is about $100 million a year. We also have a number of voluntary contributions that we make through our U.S. Agency for International Development and our Department of Health and Human Services that has ranged between $270 million to $400 million over the past couple of years. So it is a significant piece of the WHO operational budget, and it will affect their ability to operate, particularly in the low and middle income countries, which have less capacity to respond to this outbreak.
Amanda, as I understand it, WHO certainly is working on the coronavirus, but it has a lot of other programs, vaccination programs and things like that around the world. As a practical matter, what is it doing right now on coronavirus? How much of its activities are devoted to that? Will this interfere with its ability to help the world cope with this pandemic?
It certainly will. It's a very expensive distraction at a really important time when all hands should be on deck to make sure, as you say, first, that in existing really important interventions like childhood immunization are sustained during this period. You know, if measles vaccination rates fall, that means kids will die. And the WHO plays a really important role in that, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. They also provide the technical guidance on pandemic influenza monitoring, on polio eradication. All of those things are super important for WHO. And so it's just a distraction at a time when they really need to focus on the mission.
Getting past the distraction, if we can, I want to come back to something you suggested, which is possible reform of the WHO. What are the prospects that actually coming out of this distraction, as you call it, in the long run, we might have more teeth, I think was the expression you used, given to the WHO?
Yeah, so as an intergovernmental organization, as you've said, you said that they could use their voice to name and shame, but it's actually very difficult for an organization that's owned by governments to name and shame. In the wake of the Ebola outbreak, the global community, the high-income countries for the most part, created something called the Global Preparedness and Monitoring Board. And the idea was that that entity, an independent entity, could give some voice and could do the naming and shaming that was needed when governments didn't want to allow in official investigators. And so I'd like to see that Global Preparedness and Monitoring Board have some teeth, have a mandate, have a budget to be able to investigate these kinds of outbreaks and to call out countries before they're willing to make those official reports. It continues to be a problem. It was a problem in the Ebola outbreak, and it's a problem today.
So, Amanda, you know this world so well, I mean, particularly the world of global public health. Is it possible that this may correct itself over time in the sense that other countries as well are now really turning their eye on China in a critical way? Europe really has some skepticism, some tough questions about what happened. Might this correct, for the future at least, countries' behavior such as China?
I think in any kind of autocratic state, you need other ways to be able to understand what's going on than the official channel of reporting. And I always think of that pollution monitor that was on the roof of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and how that really changed the conversation. It also changed China's policies in terms of, what was the air quality in Beijing day to day, creates an independent observation. And so and also in the same way that, countries have an official estimate of gross domestic product, but then banks and other entities, watchdogs, they assess GDP they do their own analyses of what GDP should be, what inflation rate should be. And we need that actually in global public health too. We need those independent monitors that let us know what's going on.
Okay, thank you so much, Amanda. I really appreciate you being here to illuminate that for us. That's Amanda Glassman. She's from the Center for Global Development on the question of the World Health Organization. Coming up later here, we're going to hear from not one but two different presidents of feds, regional feds, about exactly what's going on with the U.S. economy. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Earlier today, our colleague Mike McKee talked to Cleveland Fed President Richard Trumka about why the Fed is going to be investing in high-yield ETFs.
Part of what we're doing and all the things that we're doing are twofold. One is, right, we're trying to make sure that the markets stay functioning. So some of the efforts that the Fed has done, right, are really geared at market functioning, and some of them are geared to make sure that, right, we mitigate the negative effects on households and businesses by making sure that we have credit flowing to those businesses. So I look at the ETF part of that as a market functioning issue. And we're continuing to look for gaps to make sure that our markets are functioning. And I would say that some of the efforts that we've taken already have improved functioning in the market. So there's two things going on. One is making sure that, and this is the Fed's responsibility, right, is to make sure that we have markets that are well functioning so that credit can flow, right, and do what it can to help shore up the economy to prepare it for the recovery. So, you know, we can disagree on kind of what the right way to do that is, but part of what we're doing is to try to make sure that we have functioning financial markets, precisely because those are an essential ingredient for the economy, for that any other policies that we do can flow through. So there's a transmission to the households and businesses that need those fundings.
I know that at this point, the Fed is all in, doing everything it can to try to support the economy. When we get to that third quarter, maybe reopening, and it's time to stimulate the economy, is there more you think you need to do or can do, and what would that be?
So I think we're going to have to see how what it looks like when we get there. I don't think we're up against any kind of constraint on what we can do. As you've seen, I think we acted appropriately, rapidly, in an unprecedented, rapidly way, really because of the recognition of how deep this shock was, and engineered because of the investment we're making in public health, right? So when we get to that point, we're going to look at our tools, do what we can, again, to support some of the programs that the federal government is doing, in terms of like the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, et cetera, and then be prepared to use our tools as appropriate.
That was Cleveland Fed President Laura Mester. Yesterday, I talked to the Dallas Fed President, Robert Kaplan, and he said, like she did, they're not done yet necessarily on their lending facilities.
We're continuing to look for pockets of the economy that have been overlooked in what we're doing, and through no fault of their own, are under stress. And so I would say my own mindset would be we should be open-minded about continuing to look for areas, whether it's nonprofits would be a good example. The issue of mortgages, mortgage servicers is something obviously that's under a lot of stress. What our goal is to have appropriate market functioning, and the other thing our goal is to keep intact to the maximum extent possible businesses and nonprofits that went into this healthy and only are under stress because of this situation, and we would like to do what we can to help them come out the other side and continue to function. So I think in that vein, I'd be open-minded about what else we might need to do.
Which takes us exactly to a really challenging point, that so-called moral hazard. The ones who came into it healthy through no fault of their own, they're under stress, as opposed to some who came in not so healthy. Sometimes you have to bail out both. You have to help both just to get this through it. Are you concerned about the moral hazard, and how do we come back off of that and return to a world where you are rewarded for prudence and you're not rewarded for the opposite?
So I am concerned about that, and that's why on the corporate corporate bond program, we've sort of set a cutoff of I think March 22nd, March 23rd. If you were investment grade on that date, you're in the program. So that will include some fallen angels, i.e. companies that were investment grade but have been downgraded. We have said that we will buy high yield ETFs, but that's going to be in relatively small size, and it's intended to help market functioning.
That was Dallas Fed President Rob Kaplan. And now we're joined by Mike McKee, who had that conversation with Laura Mester. So what did we learn from this? It sounds like the Fed is not done yet, as we're looking for another meeting coming up later in the month.
They're not done yet. We don't know exactly what they're going to do, however. The programs that they have announced and the steps they've taken have been designed to put a floor under the economy. And you heard Mester say we want to keep people working so the companies don't disappear. And we want to open the pipes. We want to make sure that the financial system works so whatever we do to stimulate the economy gets to the economy. What are they going to do to stimulate the economy? Well, they've already cut rates to zero. They are already doing QE. Is there anything else? We don't know yet. It's kind of going to depend on how quickly the economy is recovering and what sectors are recovering when we finally start to grow again.
Well, and Mike, some of what they've done, they haven't quite done yet. They've announced but haven't done, like the Main Street lending, I don't believe is up and running yet. So how long is it going to be before they actually get the money out?
That's going to be about 2 weeks, they said, to get that started. And all of this is very difficult for everybody to do. Even the PPP program, you have to have some sympathy for the SBA and the banks who tried to do this as fast as possible. But they are going to start getting money out soon, and the Fed at least is lending to companies that in theory have something of a cash cushion. But the question is, how long does this virus keep everybody down? Does it keep us locked up for another 2 months, 3 months? Or do we start to see businesses get back and start earning money again? And even if they get back, are people going to spend money? A lot of unanswered questions yet that the Fed has to wait for the answers to before they can decide what they're going to do.
Yeah, and one of the big questions, of course, is when the oversight kicks in, because people are starting to talk about we need a little more oversight for all this. Yeah,
that's going to be an issue. There was a lot of strange stuff billed to the federal government under the TARP program during the financial crisis. They want to make sure that doesn't happen again. And everybody's going to want to know, who are you lending money to? What companies? What was the actual need? There's already criticism under the PPP program that hedge funds, people who make a lot of money, have gone in and gotten loans that they didn't really need, but it was free money, so they took advantage of it. So this will be very closely scrutinized by people on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, bailouts for hedge funds, not very popular on Capitol Hill. Thank you so much, Mike, for that great interview and for joining us today. Great to talk with you. Coming up here, we're going to talk to Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, about exactly what's going on with the proposal for more spending now, a new spending bill coming out, just before he has a call with Mike Pence, the Vice President. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. There is something of a stalemate up on Capitol Hill over trying to re-up the amount of money being given to small businesses. They went through the $349 billion and they've run out. The question is, what more do they need and what should it go for? We are welcoming now Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio, who is in the center of this. Actually, will be on the call with Vice President Mike Pence coming up in just about half an hour from right now. Senator, thank you so much for joining us. So there clearly is a need. I think everyone agrees there's a need to have more money for small business. So what is the hang-up at this point? Is it a question of what conditions you put on the extra money on going to small business, or is it other things such as hospitals and states?
Well, we know, we recognize absolutely, and every Democrat does, every Republican does, that the need to help more, to help, to provide more to small business to help them. We don't want it just to be that, and we know that if Senator McConnell is able to get that, he may not come back and want to help with hospitals and state and local government and emergency assistance for people who might be on the verge of eviction. Food banks, food SNAP program, all of that, because the need is so great everywhere. A lot of us spend much of the day on conference calls with all kinds of people, from food banks to grocery store workers to bus drivers to veterans to seniors to banks, and I've talked to a number of community bankers too. And the need is everywhere. We want to do this. We just want to do it all together so that that we can reach out more than as much as the business community needs this help in small businesses. We want some changes in the program. We do see, as your story has said, that too many people that don't need it seem to have their hands out. And this administration also has a reputation of helping their friends, their special interest friends, even more than most politicians do. And so we want to do all that, but we can do it in a week if Senator McConnell would open the negotiations with us.
Do you have to get it by unanimous consent? Because given the situation, social distancing and things, it's going to be hard to bring everybody back to Capitol Hill to get a vote. So do you have to have it by unanimous consent? Does that essentially make you hostage to any individual member?
Well, it does that. I mean, you can point back, if you want, you can point back to the last vote was 96 or 98 to nothing, whatever the number was. The nothing is the key number, the zero. But I think you're right. If you go into negotiations and one outlier or member of the Senate, and there are often a couple, especially the sort of far right of a generally very conservative Republican Party. You see that. But there are ways of doing it without bringing everybody back to get a quorum to do what we need to do that way. The House can figure out a way too. But the point is, let's start the negotiations now. I know Senator Schumer's talking to the administration, but I want Speaker Pelosi in it. I want Senator McConnell to do it. I want the Republican leader in the House, McCarthy, there. So it should be a basically five-way negotiation, and we all have let Senator Schumer, or the Democratic leader for Senate Democrats, the leader for Senate Democrats, we've let them know what we need, and each of us, and we hear from people all the time about what our states need. We trust the negotiations can work well then. They could wrap up in a week or 10 days. If we have to come back and vote quickly and leave, I don't want to expose my staff to it. I'm not going to get on an airplane again. People that I've been on one in about 4 weeks. I can drive because it's Ohio. But people west of the Mississippi have a pretty long trip. But I think there are ways of doing this, but it's got to start with McConnell actually wanting to start the negotiations, which he's refused to do.
What are you hearing from your constituents back in Ohio?
I'm hearing mostly, I talked to a group of people yesterday that you wouldn't necessarily think about. I talked to grocery store workers. And they have all kinds of levels of concern about where they work and their exposure to the public, and they know that coworkers have gotten sick. They also know, I mean, to me, it shows we call them essential workers. Many of the people we call essential workers, our government and our society, and no offense, but our news media pay little attention to. They're the bus drivers. They're the mostly women that do the housekeeping at the hospital. They're the janitors and the security guards and the grocery store workers and the checkout people at drugstores. They're essential workers. They're all working now. They have to. We need them. I get to work at home. I'm privileged to get to work at home like millions of Americans. But these essential workers, most of them make only moderate to low income wages, and we should be giving them a pandemic bonus. We should be, first of all, making sure their workplaces are safe. Those that are union workplaces, like some of the workers I talked to yesterday, can get their companies to pay more attention to safety. Those that are not union have a little more difficulty getting their companies to pay attention to making their workplaces safer. We know that. I think we're going to learn some lessons from this in the days after, the days when this virus is actually in the rearview mirror.
Senator, there are proposals, as you know so well, you've made some of them about trying to take care of those essential workers, as you call them, both premium pay, but also maybe sick pay, job security, things like that. Is it realistic, you think, to get that in this fourth wave, so to speak, of the spending bill?
I think it's realistic to get some part of it, maybe not as much as some of us would like. I think one thing that policymakers who, one of my favorite Abraham Lincoln stories is he was in the White House and his staff said, you got to stay in the White House and win the war and free the slaves and preserve the Union. And Lincoln said, no, I got to go out and get my public opinion back. And I'm hopeful that my colleagues in the Senate are spending enough time on the phones talking to people that they really do see what sick pay means. So you're a $12 an hour hourly wage earner. You're the principal breadwinner for your family. You get sick. You have to make a decision. Do I go to work sick, maybe getting sicker, maybe infecting others, or do I stay home and lose that $12 an hour, $96 a day pay when I can barely make my rent anyway? Nobody should be faced with that in the society. And we're hearing those, I think even the most dug-in, combative, conservative Republican is hearing enough of those stories that maybe they'll understand we really do need some long-term sick day policies and other things like that to protect this essential workforce.
Yeah. And finally, Senator, talk to us about unemployment insurance, because there's a lot of money that's been appropriated for that. Is it getting to the people who need it? How's it working in your home state of Ohio?
Well, it's the difference between this federal unemployment and state unemployment is most states have restricted unemployment only to, they've shortened the number of weeks, they've reduced the benefits, the weekly dollar benefits, and they've also narrowed the definition of who's eligible. In our bill, which is $600 a week for people who are part-time, people who are gig workers, people who are self-employed, the woman that owns the salon or the guy that owns the barber shop, they are eligible now. That's going to make a huge difference in their lives, and I'm hopeful that we look at unemployment insurance the way that we should, that people that don't choose to but lose their jobs can get by on the amount they need, on the amount of what they need, what they're getting can get by on that amount. I'm hopeful we can extend that beyond July 31st, because it's clear to most of us that while this pandemic may have played itself out mostly by then, that a lot of people will at least start returning to work by that date. The economy's not going to be, President's comments notwithstanding, the economy's not going to be vaulted forward in a way that brings unemployment down to medium or low single digits.
Right. Senator, really appreciate your time. We know you have a busy day today. That's Senator Sherrod Brown, Democrat of Ohio. And now it's time for Bloomberg First Word News. And for that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. China is pressing back against President Trump and some of his officials who've repeated a theory that the coronavirus was set loose by a Chinese lab that let it escape. China says the Trump administration is trying to shift the focus from its own missteps in dealing with the pandemic. A scientific consensus is still evolving, but the leading theory is that infection among humans began at an animal market in Wuhan, probably from an animal that got the virus from a bat. Russia is worried that the worst is still to come. President Vladimir Putin said today the country has not yet seen a peak of infections. He urged federal and regional officials to work harder to get ventilators, protective gear, and other necessary supplies. Russia has more than 32,000 confirmed coronavirus cases. More than 270 people have died. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says more social distancing is still needed. Abe declared a state of emergency in Tokyo and other urban areas 10 days ago and says many people are following the guidelines, but not enough. Prime Minister Abe says Tokyo set a record of 201 daily increase of coronavirus cases for a total of almost 3,000, calling the situation, quote, severe. Japan has nearly 10,000 cases and 160 deaths. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. Coming up, we have Jane Harman of the Wilson Institute on dealing with national security in a time of a pandemic. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, even as a pandemic sweeps the world, national security concerns persist. We welcome now the President and CEO of the Wilson Center, I beg your pardon, Jane Harman. She served for 9 terms in the U.S. Congress. So, Jane, thank you so much for being with us today. First of all, I always want to ask about preparedness. Are we prepared after we had that awful incident with the aircraft carrier, the Roosevelt? Are we prepared, both the United States and also our allies in NATO?
Well, it's a complicated question, David, and nice to be back on the show. We have learned that ships are germ factories, and our Navy travels on ships, surprise. But the other parts of our military, the Army and the Marines, not the ones in the Navy, and the Air Force, don't. So I heard our Defense Secretary Esper say recently that we are prepared, that readiness is a huge focus, And I think that we will have to adjust to a world where pandemics make all of us vulnerable in ways we hadn't planned.
So let's talk about some of the things that are on your list for what we need to be prepared for. Maybe start with Afghanistan and what's going on in Afghanistan, because we tend to be so consumed with the coronavirus for good and sufficient reason, we forget about those things like Afghanistan.
Right. We can't forget about Afghanistan. I wrote an op-ed recently that says the bad guys are not waiting on coronavirus to launch attacks. And in Afghanistan, just about a month ago or so, the administration announced a peace deal with the Taliban, negotiated with them, but not the government of Afghanistan. They were left out. But the peace deal is that the Afghan government will let some of their prisoners go, and they will negotiate in good faith with the government. Problem: the government has two different elected leaders at the moment, both claiming victory. So the government is really not functioning. Same kind of thing is going on in Israel. And so I worry that there could be a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. I worry more, by the way, that the missile tests in North Korea and the fact that the Iranians are doing provocative actions against our vessels transiting the Persian Gulf could lead to some miscalculation.
Well, what about that? Talk about Iran, which is, I guess, between Afghanistan and Israel. On the other hand, they basically have gunboats, as I understand, buzzing U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf.
Yeah, that's exactly what they have. And it's not new behavior, but it just happened this week. 11 Iranian naval vessels buzzed 5 of our ships. This is according to U.S. Central Command. I don't think there has been a response. I don't think anyone was hurt. But let's remember that there also were attacks on 2 U.S. bases in Afghanistan following the drone killing of Soleimani, the head of Iranian intelligence. So it's not clear to me what our strategy is there. And I worry, again, about a miscalculation, something that would set off others in the Gulf. Iran is fighting the coronavirus just like we are. They've had a major incident. They have 73,000 cases and 4.5 thousand deaths. That's a higher number than some of the other countries you were just quoting, and yet they're doing this too. It's very worrisome, and I'm not clear what our strategy is.
I also wonder, Jane, is there a potential that this will change the world's relations, not just U.S. relations with China? Because I saw a report today that apparently the British government is reconsidering its position on Huawei now. And there are various people in Europe, forget the United States, in Europe, who are saying, I'm not sure that we can trust China. Is it possible that China's relations with the world might be shifted because of this?
I think that's possible. I think that the fact that this virus originated in China and that it was underreported, that's certainly a credible claim, is hurting China. China's economy is contracting. What the British did is not completely abandon Huawei, but they now have a contract with Ericsson, and so that's very interesting. But I'm hopeful that in the end, I think the only way to deal with a pandemic, which is a worldwide epidemic, is to work together as a world. And we are buying Chinese equipment. Some of it's not working. That's another issue. In Britain, they invested in some faulty equipment to protect against the virus. But what I'm saying is, rather than say, oh, great, China's failing, and then not have a strategy for the world going forward, I'd love to say this is an opportunity to see whether we can have a more clear-eyed and appropriate relationship with China.
And the United States certainly has adversaries, but beyond that, I wonder if one of the biggest threats sometimes to our national security is just simple civil unrest around the world. We have not yet seen, I'm afraid, the full extent of this pandemic in some of the poorer countries around the world and what it could do to their populations. How big a risk is that for our own U.S. national security?
I think it's a huge risk. The population of Africa is the fastest growing population. The number of people in Africa will double by 2050. And we were very helpful in Africa against the Ebola virus. And Now it seems to me we're not doing so much. I mean, there is a possibility that through efforts, both of the George W. Bush administration, supported strongly by Nancy Pelosi, this program we set up to help Africa could be used against coronavirus. But if it's not, what goodwill we generated will turn, and in addition to the humanitarian tragedy that could happen. So we need a worldwide strategy. Building bigger walls to keep people out is not going to fix the threat of a pandemic. And we're not going to stop travel forever between us and the rest of the world, and we're not going to stop all trade either. And so I, again, hope that we use this crisis as an opportunity, to quote former Mayor Rahm Emanuel, as an opportunity to figure out what needs fixing, starting with at-home infrastructure, et cetera, but also start figuring out what needs fixing in the U.S. Connection to parts of the world that should be our friends.
Okay, Jane, thank you so very much for joining us today. Always a delight to have you on. That is Jane Harman. She is the President and CEO of the Wilson Institute. Coming up next here, we're going to have Richard Trumka. He's the head of this AFL-CIO. And what is his plan for getting the U.S. economy back to work? This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. Well, President Trump has his outline for how to get the country back to work, but how does it fit with the needs of workers across the country? Well, we're going to talk now with a man who represents more than 12.5 million of those workers. He is Richard Trumka, and he is, of course, president of the AFL-CIO. Richard, thanks so much for being back with us. And I know that you have your own concerns and prerequisites even to get back to work. One of them is called the Emergency Temporary Contagious Disease Standard. Could you tell us what that is and why that's so critical?
Yes, it would require it would be a standard that is enforceable in court or by OSHA or MSHA that would require every employer to have a plan to go back to protect people from contagious diseases. They would have to train their employees, and then they would have to have the proper equipment, personal protective equipment on hand to protect those employees from the disease.
And you've been working with the White House, I know, on this. Are they open to this? Because I know in the past when you and I have talked, there have been some requests to OSHA, and basically the White House has not been as interested in that. Is it possible that the White House will incorporate this in their guidelines?
Well, we sure hope so. We're going to make it part of CARE 2 and make sure that it gets done. Because, look, thousands of complaints regarding the coronavirus have been filed with OSHA and MSHA over the last couple of months. They've done virtually nothing with it because they have nothing to enforce. This administration did away with the standard, so there's nothing for them to enforce. So our point is strong workplace safety protections and standards have to be implemented, and they have to be enforced before the economy reopens, because lives depend on that, David.
If by any chance you can't get it done at the federal level, is there a chance that you get this done state by state, or even for that matter, collective bargaining agreement by collective bargaining agreement?
Well, that's possible, but unless you do it at the federal level, you'll have groups that are missed. For instance, public employees right now aren't covered by the standard. If we do a federal standard, we would cover those federal employees so that no matter what sector of the economy you're in, you're covered and protected, that you can be protected if you go back to work and not have to rely on just chance and luck.
So a contagious disease standard, one thing you'd like to get in the next bill. What about the Worker Health Coverage Protection Act, which would actually give health care for those laid off?
Well, there are 4 or 5 things that we think are necessary in the next CARES bill. Health care is important. You have 22 million people have lost their job in the last 4 weeks. We're approaching an unemployment rate of 20% right now. The highest we've ever had was during the Great Depression, and that rate was 24.9%. So we're bumping up against it. Those workers that are laid off also lose their health care in most instances. And so giving them health care or getting their health care paid through COBRA is absolutely essential, because during this pandemic is when they need the health care the most. So we're focused on that like a laser beam.
Yeah, and we certainly need you to be, given the fact we have 22 million people who've been laid off just in the last 3 weeks. Thank you so much. That's Richard Trumka. He is the president of the AFL-CIO, and I'm delighted to say we're going to have much more with Mr. Trumka in the second hour of Balance of Power over on Bloomberg Radio alone. We're going to talk to him about the state of his 12.5 plus million workers. And a programming note now, we'll have Wall Street Week on tomorrow, Friday evening at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and all through the weekend. Live from New York, this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.